Alrighty, good evening, everyone. Welcome back. We are now picking up with Sefer Zecharia. We're almost at the end of Treyasar. After Zecharia, we have just one more Sefer, Malachi, but it'll take a little time to get there. Zecharia is 14 chapters, so it's quite lengthy for Treyasar. 211 verses, so it's a nice number of chapters and verses. And so we'll obviously be learning this over a number of weeks. I anticipate tonight we'll introduce the Sefer and certainly learn chapters 1 and 2, and hopefully 3 as well. 3 is a much shorter chapter. We're not going to be reading all the sections inside, but we will be picking up on the major aspects of each of the chapters. And whenever there's verses that we're not going to focus on, I'll just let you know, and we'll continue onward from there. So just a little bit of background information, as we always do when it comes to a Sefer. Some of this we'll be learning as we go along, but just by way of introduction, a few pieces of information that I want us to be aware of. The Abarbanel tells us that the Sefer has 4 distinct prophecies, and that's a pretty good way of thinking about the Sefer. The first distinct prophecy is really just the first couple of verses. And through verse 6, right? It's the opening that we'll start off with in a few minutes. And then the next second prophecy brings us all the way to the end of chapter 6. So that'll be tonight and the next time we learn. And then chapter 7 through 11, and then finally 12 through 14 is the final of the 4 prophecies. And you'll see that chapters 2 and chapters 3 and chapters 4 really go one into the other, right? It's one night almost that we see the Navi having this Nevuah. So we'll see that throughout the Sefer as well. What we'll also see is that the Sefer takes place, Zecharia lives at the exact same time as Chagai, right? Not only do we know this because we've seen him quoted before with other Nevi'im, meaning in Chagai we saw, in Sefer Ezra, we saw quoted Chagai and Zecharia next to each other. But even in our Sefer itself, it's going to be abundantly clear by the dates that they overlap. Right? Zecharia is understood to be a younger prophet. Chagai is like the elder statesman. Chagai may have lived during the first temple, but Zecharia is a bit younger. Chagai is a newer prophet. And Chagai is living during, again, the same time period, the rebuilding of the second temple. Okay, so that's a little bit about the context. In terms of the person himself, Zecharia, we don't know that much about him, but we'll see hints throughout the Sefer as to who exactly he was. But we do know his name, right? Zecharia ben Berechia ben Ido Hanavi, right? Zecharia, the son of Berechia, the son of Ido Hanavi. So Chazal tell us that whenever you're the son of, it means that he was from a prophetic family. So it's likely that he was from a prophetic family whose prophets go back to the Beit Rishon. Right, so now he's returning essentially to Beit Sheni, coming back from Bavel, kind of with Zerubbabel and that whole contingent, about 42,000 Jews. So that tells us a little bit about context, and the history of the time period we really already covered with Chagai. Right, this is the time period with Cyrus's decree was a few years earlier. They're living during the time of Daryavesh, the king, and that's essentially where we're going to pick up this evening. Okay, so that was kind of the short introduction, and then we'll continue to see kind of pieces about the life and the person, and obviously his nevuot, his prophecies throughout the evening. Any questions?
Yeah, I'm following all this in Rabbi Steinsaltz's book on Navi, and he gives various charts to show who was the king and what. It's very surprising to me. I've never actually visualized this, that Hashem needed more than one prophet the same year. So for example, this is 520 when this is happening, and there are a couple of prophets. So you would think the Almighty would pick a prophet and say, okay, you go out and tell the people, here's my message, but he seems to want to have this in stereo or in quadrasound or something. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, thank you, George, for bringing that up. And we're going to see that explicitly in just a few, this evening, in just a few verses, literally not only the same time period, the same year. We're going to see that he gives prophecy, literally the dates are given 1 month before him, essentially Chagai spoke, and 1 month after Chagai spoke. And yet we have Zecharia smack in the middle. So why do we need two spokespersons for Hashem. So I think the answer is going to be their focus, right? Chagai, and this is almost like showing some of my cards already, but Chagai focuses primarily on getting the Jews to build the temple, right? That was his sole goal. His goal was to get them to build the temple. He wasn't focused on the political realm. He wasn't even so much focused on tshuva writ large. He was really just saying, build the temple. You need a house for Hashem. This is your job, your obligation. What Zecharia, on the other hand, will often focus on is we'll see in the very beginning of chapter 1, he'll focus on tshuva, right? You need to return. Not only will he focus on tshuva, though, as we will see, he is much more eschatological. He is going to, in very poetic and very imaginative language and descriptions, talk about battles, the end of days, angels. He's much more kind of taking the visions that he sees and telling us what he sees without often describing what they mean, right? We're going to see imagery and visions, but not necessarily know the pshat as the readers, right? Chagai was so clear, like we knew exactly what he was saying. He didn't kind of shield any of the text. It was so obvious to us what Chagai was describing to us. Zecharia is much more perhaps in it for the long game, right? He's showing us what's going to happen over the next thousands of years. So perhaps they had different goals. One focused it much more micro on the here and now, Chagai, and Zecharia is much more broad and much more for the future as well. So I think that's one way to look at it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but I'll also just post right here for those who don't already have the source sheet. I've given you all of chapter 1, 2, and 3 with a few Rishonim that we're going to look at as well, but we're not going to read all of 1, 2, and 3 inside. Certainly not. Okay, so let's look inside. So before we even look at the text, I want to look at Rashi on verse 1, chapter 1. Nevuat Zecharia. Rashi gives us a little introduction. Stuma hi me'od. It is a very closed book, meaning it is very hard to understand Sefer Zecharia. And this is Rashi. If Rashi is telling us it's hard to understand, so it's going to be hard to understand, meaning we don't really know what he's saying in many of his nevuot. Why? Ki yesh ba marot dumot lachalom. Most of them are like dreams. Like imagine somebody wakes up in the middle of the night and they had a dream, and people do this, they take dream diaries. It's almost what we are reading. And it actually goes even deeper than that because Zecharia's nevuot, certainly in the first couple of chapters, are all at night. Right? They are dreams. He has dreams and he essentially writes them down for us. So they're very difficult to understand. And he says, we don't really know the answer. We don't really know the true answer to his dreams until, when are we going to find out? Until, that's an allusion to the Mashiach. Mashiach will come and tell us what all of these mean, and then we'll be able to finally understand what Zecharia is teaching us. So as we'll see, much of his prophecies are in the realm of the wondrous, of the fantastical. In some ways, it would make a really good movie, right? Especially with all the graphics that we have at our fingertips today. So in that sense, it's going to be closed because we don't really know what every object represents. What we're going to do together is I'm going to give you a couple of options in terms of what they might mean, according to some of the major Mefarshim. Right? I think that's one of the ways in which we'll look at the texts together. So let's open up. Verses 1 through 6, Abarbanel tells us, is the opening prophecy. It's really the introduction to Sefer Zecharia. So what happens? This is the B'chodesh Hashmini, the 8th month, right? So we're talking about Cheshvan, right? If Tishrei is the 7th month, Cheshvan, Bishnat Shtayim L'Daryavesh, the exact same year as Chagai, right? Just as George pointed out, the same year, about circa 520 BCE. Hayad Devar Hashem el Zecharia ben Berachia ben Ido Hanavi Lemor, right? Prophecy went to Zecharia. And then what's the prophecy essentially going to be teaching us? Without reading it all inside, essentially what we're being told is that if you return to me, Hashem, I will return to you. Right? God was angry at your forefathers. Katzaf Hashem alabosechem chatzef. God is angry at you. Shuvu elai neum Hashem tzvakot. Return to me, v'ashuv aleichem. Right? This is not a new theme. We've seen this in many other Nevi'im, but the focus on tshuva is the opening passage of Zecharia. And if you remember, we're talking to a generation who is returning both geographically and spiritually back to the land of Israel and to Hashem. So they're coming back and bringing with them some of their not so appropriate practices and beliefs from Babylonia. So he wants to remove that from the people. And we'll see the Mefarshim kind of make connections between our Sefer and Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah, where we get a little bit more in depth as to the sins of the generations. So we'll see allusions to that as we go along. Right? Don't be like your ancestors, because who are your ancestors? The Jews who lived during Chorban Habayit, right? They sinned. Don't be like them. It's time to rebuild and renew. That's what this is all about. And essentially what he's saying is listen to me, listen to your prophets, and we'll be able to move forward together. That essentially is prophecy number one. That is the opening of Sefer Zecharia. Again, it's about returning to the land of Israel. And in some senses, this particular prophecy, mimics Yeshayahu, it mimics Amos, it mimics a lot of earlier prophets. There's a lot of parallels in the language itself. And that's the opening prophecy of Sefer Zecharia. So we've essentially now just seen the first opening prophecy, and it's much more clear, much more straightforward. But now we get into his vision, his second prophecy, as Abarbanel calls it, which we'll be learning this week and next week. And here's where things start to kind of take a turn for the somewhat incomprehensible in terms of how we are trying to figure out what the prophet is really getting at, right? There's going to be various approaches, and I hope to bring a couple of them before you. Any questions on that very opening passage before we move on? Okay, so here we go. The very opening passage. I'm going to come up with my own little titles for these visions. You'll see the Mefarshim reference them in different ways, but the opening part of the next vision we're about to see is essentially the man. I'm going to call it the man on the horse, right? It's going to be, there's going to be horses, there's going to be men, angels, there's going to be conversations, God, the Navi. What is going on? So what I'd like to do with you is we'll look at some of the verses inside. We'll go through the pshat, like what is the text actually telling us? And it's actually not so easy just to get through the pshat, because it seems to be there's a lot of pieces that are almost missing. So there are actually a number of Mefarshim that note that, it makes sense in many ways that Zecharia only wrote down what he felt he needed to tell us, so that he may have had a dream, a vision that was much longer, much more broad, but he cut out the pieces he didn't necessarily need us to hear. But secondly, this is a dream, a vision of Hashem that goes through the prophet. And in many ways, it's confusing, right? You wake up in the morning and want to tell somebody about a dream you had, good luck, right? They can sometimes be quite confusing and confounding, and the details get mixed up. And we see that in a very real way in these prophecies. And in that way, like Rashi says, it's stuma. It's a little confounding, a little closed to truly understand what's going on. But we're going to try our best. So let's look inside. I need this little gap here to show the difference here. And here we go. Okay, so where are we? Bayom esrim va'arba'a. We're on the 24th day, la'ashteasar chodesh, to the ashteasar, to the 11th month. The 11th month of the year is Shvat. Right? Adar is the 12th month. We're in this year, the 13th and the 12th month. But here we are in the 11th month. So we're talking about the 24th day of Shvat. Hu chodesh Shvat, it says this explicitly. Bishnat Shnaim l'Dayavash, again, the same year. So we're talking about, 2-3 months later. What happens? Here's the vision. Ra'iti halayla. I saw at night. And it's important because all these visions are going to happen at night. And what do I see? Vihine, and behold, Ish rochev al sus adom. Okay, so the story goes as follows. Shot. We have an angel riding, a man riding a red horse. Okay? Vuhu omeid ben hadasim, and the horse with the man riding on top of it is standing among hadasim, right? Myrtle trees, branches. Asher b'metzula. Metzula, maybe it means like it's a little swampy or it's in a valley. And what's behind the man on the horse among the Hadassim? Va'acharav susim adumim. Behind them are even more red horses. Serukim. This word, Rashi tells us he doesn't know what it means. Serukim, it's described here sorrel. Others describe it, it's some sort of color. And ulevanim, and white. So you have your red horses, your serukim, and your levanim. Some think maybe it's like a combination of the red and the white. But you have 3 different color horses behind him. Okay, so that's how we open up the prophecy. So Pshat is that you have a man on a horse, and we're going to see Zecharia appears in just a moment also. But before we go further, any ideas? What could this, you've hopefully read through this already. What runs through your mind? Man on a horse, there's horses behind him, they're standing amongst some reeds, some hadassim. What comes to mind?
The Yam Suf.
Yam Suf. Okay, so we have this notion of Yam Suf. There's horses, there's reeds, mitzula, bimtzolot kamo. Right, we have that in Az Yashir, right? That they sink in the mitzula. So,
but why red?
So why red? What's Adom? It's a good question.
We have the red heifer, but the red horses.
Well, if they die, if the Egyptians die, you have the blood.
So red is reminiscent of blood. So we have a couple of things emerging here.
Right.
Well, essentially, that particular approach, I'll just share with you all. So that hits it in many ways what some assume is going on here, that there is a reflection in this particular prophecy, in some sense, back to Geulat Mitzrayim, right? We're redeemed from Egypt at that moment. So we have almost looks like Yam Suf type language, but we're not talking about Kriyas Yam Suf. We're not talking about a redemption from Egypt because we're talking about something in the future or something in the present. So this leads Rashi to tell us that what's going on here is a reference to the redemption from Babylonia. Right, the Jews are primarily still living in Bavel, even though Babylonia has fallen. Paras is now the empire, and this is somehow representative of the Jews who are living b'mitzula, which is a reference perhaps to Babylonia. Babylonia is in the valley by the rivers, so maybe this is a reference to the Jews that are living there, and we want them to come home. So maybe that's a little bit about what is going on here. What about the colors? It's hard to say exactly what they're trying to get at, but there's distinctions that are supposed to be made here. There are different types of horses. Let's continue on and try to figure out a little bit more. Okay, Va'omar. Then the Navi, Zecharia, who's among them, says, Ma'ela Adoni, what are these? Vayomer Elai HaMalach, the Malach answers, so this is probably the man sitting on the horse, although here he's a Malach. Earlier, it was an Ish, so maybe this is another character. This is an angel speaking to Zecharia, talking about the scene that he's witnessing. Right? He sees these people being the Hadassim, among the myrtles. And Rashi says that the Babylonia was apparently known for Hadassim as well, so he thinks that maybe it's Babylonia. He says, what's going on here? What are these things? So, Vayan Ha'ish Ha'omid ben Hadassim, the man that stood amongst the myrtles, who was presumably maybe the man on the horse, says, Eile asher shalach Hashem lihitalech ba'aretz. Who are all these horses? Who are these horses behind me? We are told by God to walk among the earth. Lihitalech ba'aretz. We've seen similar language before back in Genesis, right? That there are those who walk with Hashem. Avraham walks ba'aretz. So lihitalech ba'aretz usually means often something positive, right? You have angels who have come down to walk among the earth, among mankind. It's almost reminiscent of the Nephilim who came down. There's something going on here, but what are they doing on earth? It's almost like they're coming on earth to tell us something, to let us know what's happening and what's going on. And we'll see in a moment what's actually happening on earth. So the angel who's standing among the Hadassim says the following. We're walking among the earth. The whole earth is peaceful, is quiet. Everyone is sitting peacefully among themselves. So Rashi assumes that maybe what they're describing here is the fact that we've made it to a point where there's peace on earth. Right? Think about the moment that they're sitting in. So Babylonia has been conquered. The Jews are living under the Persian Empire. Generally speaking, it's peaceful. Yes, we learned about the Jews fighting the locals, but the Jews living in what's Babylonia or now under Persian rule is peaceful, right? There's peace among the nations of the world. So if we're talking about the present day, right, 520 BCE, so maybe the Nevuah is talking about the current kind of geopolitical situation, right? There is peace on earth, says the Navi. But the problem is, if there's peace on earth, well, why isn't the temple rebuilt yet? Remember, we're in the second year. They have not yet rebuilt the temple. That's what Chagai is all about. So now we get to part 2 of this description. What happens next? It's very peaceful, verse 12. So Vayan Malach Hashem Vayomar Hashem Tzvakot Ad Matai Ata'olot Tirachem et Yerushalayim. If there's peace on earth, if you think that the nations of the world are acting properly, Jews have somewhat returned to the land of Israel, why do you not have compassion upon Jerusalem? Why is the temple not yet built? Why are the Jews still suffering in Jerusalem? For 70 years, we've waited to rebuild the temple and it hasn't come yet. What's so interesting about this claim that we see the Malach Hashem say is that with Chagai told the people, it's your turn to get up and build. Right? Chagai implores the people that you're the ones who are being lazy and are not building. And yet in Zecharia, we flip the whole discussion. We now focus on Hashem. Hashem, why have you not built the temple? And in some sense, this reminds me of kind of the discussions that the Gemara already has, and that certainly have made its way into Zionism in the 20th century, which is like, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to return to land, rebuild the temple, rebuild a country? Or are we supposed to wait for the Messiah to do that? And in some sense, we have a little bit of a Chagai-Zecharia divide here, where Chagai says, you have to build it. And Zecharia says, Hashem, why have you not come back and built it? And that kind of goes back to it's like a chicken and the egg kind of discussion here. But even Zecharia opens up and says, if you return to me, I will return to you. And so we have 40,000 Jews living in the land of Israel. And so Zecharia and the Malach in this dream are essentially asking each other, having a conversation, Hashem, we're back. Why is the temple not yet built? And like George said, Chagai and Zecharia are literally speaking at the exact same time, both speaking the word of Hashem. So you kind of see the differences in perspective. And I don't think it's a question of who's right and who's wrong. It's just different perspectives about our relationship with God and what we're supposed to be doing in our own lives, how we're supposed to act, and what we perhaps expect of God and what we're expected to do ourselves.
Does the red horse potentially make reference to the bloodshed that our people passed through?
Yeah, so certainly red, that goes back to what I think Ali was saying also, red is blood. Red often represents blood. And so perhaps the red, like the person on the red horse may represent this notion that we're like riding on the blood of our ancestors, right? So many Jews were killed during the Churban HaBayit and did not make it to where we are. And now we're almost like riding in on what's left. Right, it's an image perhaps of showing like we are the ones who are continuing, but it's only because we have lost so many before that. That could be one way to interpret it. So how does this kind of horse story end? The story with the horse and the man. So how does it end? So let's look how it ends. So essentially, he says, "Yeah, I'm going to come and I'm going to give you good news. Hadover bi dvarim tovim, dvarim nichumim, like nechama. I'm going to give you words of comfort." So essentially, what's the words of comfort? Kineti liRushalayim u'letzion kina gedola. I, Hashem, says, I'm jealous. I want Jerusalem back. I want Yerushalayim. V'ketzef gadol ani kotzef al hagoyim, and therefore I will exact punishment on all of the nations hasha'ananim that are too at ease. Meaning, before we said that there was peace on earth, and this was something to look forward to. But Hashem is saying that sometimes if there is too much quiet on earth, there's some sort of, people aren't really doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be engaging the world in some sort of sense. And I'm going to be angry upon those who have not exactly done their work on earth. Some assume that this is not really a reference to the nations, but maybe a reference to the Jews who are not doing their work, right? Sometimes you kind of you want to say something bad about the Jews, sometimes you just say, the nations, but we're really referring to the Jews, that the Jews have not done what they're supposed to do. Only 40,000 Jews returned. The rest are still in Bavel. So maybe God is saying, you're too quiet, right? You're too comfortable in Babylonia. I need to shake things up for you to get back to the land of Israel. So then what happens at the very end of the story? So Hashem says, I'm going to let you rebuild the temple. And this imagery is a little bit more obvious, I think, in terms of what it means. Therefore, Lachen Kwamar Hashem, Shafti Yerushalayim. I will return to Jerusalem, my presence, my Shechina, Birachamim, and this we should know, this comes as like Uvnei Yerushalayim and Yerushalayim Ircha. We have language like this in our liturgy. Beiti Yibane, I will build my home. Again, I will build my home. Or Beiti Yibane, it will be built. Neum Hashem Tzvakot, says Hashem. And then what's happening here? Vikav, a line, Yinate al Yerushalayim, will be drawn, will be stretched over Jerusalem. What does it mean to have a line stretched over Jerusalem? Any thoughts? You can guess.
That he'll preserve Yerushalayim now that it's been rebuilt, that it'll be protected.
So maybe this is like almost like the hand of God protecting Jerusalem. Yeah. Any other ideas? So a number of Mefarshim assume, and we'll see this again in the second Perek Bet, that remember, we're rebuilding Jerusalem. So essentially, we're going to have imagery of Hashem being the contractor. God's the builder. So what is God doing? The angel God's measuring out Yerushalayim. Okay, the wall is going to be this big, and we'll see about walls in a moment. The temple is going to be this long and this wide and this tall. And so maybe the kav is reference to literally like a measuring tape, right? God is measuring Yerushalayim. And that we'll see actually more explicit, I think, in chapter 2 itself.
How about the line connecting the Jews or didn't choose to come back? Now we have the temple. So there's something very, very holy. And now this line stretches over Jerusalem and goes east to Babylonia, trying to connect the holiness of Jerusalem with the lack of holiness in Babylonia. I
love it. It's great. I also think it's interesting because if you look on the pasuk, it says vikav, which means a line, but it's the way it's written in the text is with a hey. We read it as vikav. The hey is silent, but vikaveh may also be like hope. So maybe like the word tikva. So maybe there is this sense that the line is like represents the sort of hope that something better is about to come. And the verse ends, therefore, tifutzana arei mituv, there's going to be greatness overflowing, v'nicham Hashem od at Zion, uvachar od b'Yerushalayim. God will once again choose Jerusalem as our holy city. The temple will be rebuilt. So we open up in a very positive manner, right? You return to me, I return to you. There's some sort of symbiotic relationship here. The temple will be rebuilt. And it is, like during his time period, this is when the temple is being rebuilt. The Jews during the times of Chagai are building the temple during this time. It'll take a few years to complete, but they are doing God's work. Okay. Any questions or other thoughts on chapter 1 before we move on to the next prophecy?
I was thinking that the line is also like a lifeline. It's going to be the lifeline for all Jews to Yerushalayim and to Hashem. Yeah. The ones in Babel as well, of course, particularly.
Yeah, it's like directions. This is the arrow. This is the connection that you're going to have. Yeah.
I have a question about the horse. If you think about it, the Babylonians were known for their horses. The Babylonians and the Assyrians. And the red horses is the beginning of that comforting vision that they're going to end drowned in blood.
Yeah, so I think there's...
I'm going to revenge what they did. I don't know, is this a time when they've been allowed to go back to Eretz Israel?
Yes, Jews were permitted to return. Most...
Yovesh said that...
but they were permitted to return. It was not an easy task, an easy journey. They've been living there for almost 70 years, so most did not return. Yeah.
So is this prophecy talking about the second temple, or is it talking about end of days? Particularly, he talks about the other nations will come and join you and follow God, and that really didn't happen in Second Temple times. So is this Second Temple or end of days?
Great question. So Rashi assumes we're really talking about the present, right? The time of Zecharia. The Abarbanel takes a different approach and thinks we're talking somewhat in the future. Not so clear that he thinks it's the end of days. We'll see that in other places. But he thinks a lot of this is actually referring to like the righteous people are the ones who will be returning to Jerusalem, and the non-righteous people will not return. And there will be some sort of recognition of Hashem, perhaps during the time of the Greeks. We'll see, just as we saw with Haggai, there's a lot of Mefarshim, especially the Abarbanel, who assumes that much of Sefer Zecharia, right, Babylonia is done. Or, who cares about Babylonia? It's over. It's old news. Persia is a very good time for Jews. And so much of the Nevuah that we're going to be reading is going to be talking perhaps more about the Greeks than it's talking about the present Persians. When it comes to the very future, let's say the fourth kingdom, Rome, so many Mefarshim assume that there's this break in the Prakim, that somewhere in chapter 9, we switch very much to the future. And we'll get there, hopefully, I guess, after Purim.
Is this after Purim?
Machloket. According to the Gemara, yes. According to Chazal, this would seemingly be the case, but according to the Pshad and according to most Mefarshim, kind of outside of the kind of Gemara Chazal world, assume this is before the story of Purim. Yeah.
So maybe that was an omen for that.
Yeah, perhaps. Okay, so let's go on to the second chapter here. And so let's pick up, we'll pick up over here. Okay. So this one, if I kind of labeled the other one, stop here for if I labeled the other one kind of the man on the horse, so this one I'm going to title the four horns, right? It's pretty obvious why. There's going to be four horns in our story. We'll have to figure out what the four horns represent, what they mean, and what happens in chapter 2. So just by way of introduction, so the Parak is going to open up with the Navi looking at, behold, I see four horns, arba kranot, right? A keren, some sort of horn. I see these four horns, and the question is, what are they doing? What do they represent? So let's look inside, very basic shot, and then we'll see how the Mefarshim understand it. So let's look inside. Again, it seems to be the same vision. He's having this vision at night, the man on the horse, and that whole, scene 1 has ended. They move aside, and now we have a vision of four horns. I look up, v'hinei arba kranot. There are four horns. Va'omar el hamalach. Again, the same angel is talking to me, like God is talking almost like through the angel to me, the prophet. Va'omar el hamalach hadaber bi ma'ela. What are these? Again, he's asking, and he says, these are the horns asher zeiru et Yehuda et Yisrael v'Yerushalayim. What are these? These are the four horns that have zeiru, that have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. Okay, so it opens up and perhaps is describing horns that scattered us. So what does that mean? In the pshat, it would perhaps mean, right, think about a horn for a moment. You blow into a horn and sound emerges. Think of a shofar. So maybe just a sound kind of disperses. So we were dispersed or scattered during the destruction of the temple, like the sounds that emerge from a horn, right? What goes out does not return, right? It just goes out. That's what happens. 4 may just be a kind of number that they're using, but clearly, right, 4 is symbolic, and we're going to see the number 4 appear many times over. So this obviously leads a number of Mefarshim to assume that the 4 represents what? What does 4 often represent in prophecy?
For the 4, what do you call it? The diasporas. The
4 exactly. The 4 kingdoms, exactly. The 4 kingdoms, and then therefore the four diasporas. So
it could be the 4 directions of heaven.
Correct. So Rashi tells us that he thinks it refers to like the four directions of the, like the four arba kanfot haaretz, or the four. He uses the word ruchot, the four kind of directions of the in the air and the way that people live. So that's one way of looking at it. But another way is to say that maybe this is a reference to the arba malchiot, right? So before we get into what that might mean, I want to look a little bit more in the story, and then we'll come back to that. Look inside in verse 3. There were four horns. Then what happens? Vayar'eni Hashem. And then God showed me what? Arba'ah charashim. What did he then see? 4 charashim, craftsmen. Okay, so I have 4 horns, and now I have 4 craftsmen. So what's the connection, if anything? Anyone? Like, you have 4 horns and you have 4 craftsmen. What could the connection be between these two? Does anybody ever meet a shofar?
Is that the Mishkan?
So maybe. So if you think of an animal horn, just for example, so if you take the horn off of an ayil or ram, for example, you can't just blow the horn. You can't. That's not how it works. You have to carve it out, right? There's all of this. I don't know what the technical term is, but type of bone inside. You have to carve it out. It's softer than regular bone. It has to be carved out. And essentially that's what you have to do.
Cartilage.
Cartilage. Yeah. It's like
sinew.
I'll take them all. So essentially it has to be worked at, right? Today they use machines, right? You just put the shofar on and like the ram's horn, and it takes 2 seconds and they carve out the whole thing. But it would take a little bit of time. So you have 4 horns, and now you have these people who are somehow craftsmen. So perhaps what they're going to now be doing is working on those horns. So you see the horns, and now we're going to get the craftsmen who seemingly can work, mold, shape the horns. And if the horns represented scattering us, or perhaps the 4 kingdoms who scattered us, now the charashim are going to come and perhaps rectify the issue. And that's what we'll have to see in a moment.
Well, if you were doing a big building project, then you would have leaders who direct teams, maybe teams of workmen for the Beit HaMikdash, and you would give them directions with horns.
100%. So we have the same imagery, right? This is Zecharia living in Yerushalayim, watching the rebuilding of the temple. So it makes perfect sense that he would be having imagery of craftsmen working, people working, and also horns are, tell you when to do things, right? They call people, work now, end the workday, right? This is something that you would have during that time period.
And in the Beis HaMikdash, they had the silver. I mean, there were trumpets. I think they weren't really horns.
Correct.
But is Karen necessarily a horn? Because with Moshe, we had the term Karen, and it was a beam of light.
So with Moshe, because the Torah says it was literally a Karen or, right? Karne or, right? It was like a light. Yeah. So you don't have the word light here. So it's probably not specifically that. So then what happens? You have these 4 charashim. We'll get back to them in a moment. Va'omar. And so then what happens? I said, ma'ela va'im la'aso. What's the purpose of these charashim, right? I have 4 horns. What do I need craftsmen for? So eile hakranot asher zeru et Yehuda, right? These are the 4 horns, as I said, that exiled our people. Kifi ish lo nasar rosho, right? They scatter them. No man lifted up his head, right? It was undignified, right? We went into exile. So we were very scared. We were scared. And they came to frighten them. The question is, who is they and who is them? So it would appear that the charashim come to scare otam, perhaps them being, if you want to take the Abarbanel's approach, the kingdoms who exiled us. So the charashim are the saviors of the exile. We'll continue to flesh this out in a moment. Liadot et kranot hagoyim, to go and almost like take up arms in a sense against the horns of the nations, perhaps the 4 kingdoms, according to the Abarbanel. Hanosim keren el eretz Yehuda lezarota, according to the ones who hold their horns against Judea to scatter our people. Okay, so now let's explain. 4 horns, 4 charashim. represents the scattering of our people, and then the Charashim almost come to rectify the issue. I want to now focus on an Abarbanel, which really I think explains it in a really interesting way. It's on your source sheet towards the bottom. We're not going to read the whole thing inside, but I wanted to show you a little bit about how he describes it. So I'll just explain a little bit of it outside, but essentially he says, when it comes to describing the four horns and the four craftsmen, he says something which I think is quite interesting, which is that in one interpretation, he says the four craftsmen and the four horns are the exact same thing. What does that mean? When we were exiled, let's say by a horn, right? So the Babylonians exiled us, okay? And so then the next kingdom emerges. And when the next kingdom emerges, so that next kingdom becomes the charash for the previous kingdom, right? So the Babylonians who exiled us, they're the horn. So now the next empire rises and destroys the previous empire, therefore bringing about a redemption. And then what happens? Things go sour. That kingdom that just devoured the earlier one becomes the horn. And then you have to wait for a new charash to come around and destroy the earlier keren. It almost is like a Chad Gad Ya type story, right? Where you have each subsequent kingdom, on the one hand, bringing about the defeat of our previous oppressors, but almost always inevitably oppressing us at the end, right? So there's the rise and fall of the four major kingdoms. And in some sense, each kingdom saved us in a way, but then also oppressed us in a different way. So I think it's a really interesting approach where to say that, again, this is Nevuah. So, the four horns then each horn becomes the charash for the previous one. But if you think about it, there are, what's the problem with this number game? Anyone want to take a stab? What's the problem if the first horn comes about and then you need the next horn to be the charash for the previous one? And only four horns and four charashim. So how does that work? Because they're not all the same person. There's always going to be one in advance. So there ends up being a leftover. And so the Abarbanel suggests that who saves us at the very end, right, against the final kingdom, or the final horn. So who's the final charash, right? There's no fifth kingdom, right? Who's going to save us from the previous, right? So he suggests that it's us, meaning the Jews. Us with Hashem's might defeat the final kingdom, and we become the final craftsmen to essentially craft our future. Right? So with Hashem's help, we become the final craftsmen to overthrow the rule of who? Rome. Right? Rome becomes the fourth kingdom, and we ourselves are able to destroy them. And that is the approach of the Abarbanel. But I want to show you one other fascinating piece. I've done this a couple of times because I just love it when the Abarbanel, he loves to look at a Navi and put it in historical context and say, this is what it means. Now you can take it or leave it, and that's totally fine. But I want to show you something really interesting, which is what he says right over here. So first of all, he quotes her as Chazal. That says, Amru Arba'a Charashim, the Gemara in Sukkah tells us who they were. Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef, this other type of Messiah, Eliyahu v'Kohen Tzedek, another kind of messianic figure that's going to bring about redemption. That's what the Gemara tells us. So they're all Jews. But he has different interpretation. I want to show you his interpretation right here. Look at this and follow along. It's quite rich in the way that Abarbanel likes to describe things. Ha'achat, who is the first of these horns that are going to do terrible things, and also the charash who saves us? So he says, you could look at all four of these talking about the four kingdoms, but you could also read the whole story within the context of Rome. Okay? So he's now going to describe for us the four horns in the context of Rome. Ha'achat, Romi. Rome. Shehem etchilu ha'kesarim rishonim, right? They had the first Caesars. Hashenit, who are the Shenites? Anyone who's this?
Is that Constantine?
Constantine. But he's describing Constantina, which is what?
Constantinople.
Shne'etak Moshava Kesaro, because that's the Eastern Roman Empire, right? That becomes the next location. Rome falls and the Eastern Roman Empire becomes the second location, right? It doesn't really truly fall until in the 1450s. Of 1453. Shama al yedei hakisar Constantino, right? Constantine, right? Not so he goes through the history a little bit, but v'hashlishi Tzarfat. Anybody want to take a stab at France? What's talking about here? Anyone? Medieval history? Anyone?
Goth?
That was where the anti-pope.
Thank you.
Anti-
Larry Coburn, the
All right.
anti-popes in Avignon, right?
Yeah,
So they were
Avignon.
the Avignon papacy for about, what was it, 80, 90 years in the 14th century, I believe. They were the anti-pope. So the pope is the head, is the seat of the Roman kind of religion, Catholicism. So he says France is the third one. B'mea Caesar, he says during the years of Carlo, Lav Dafka exactly, but fine, who was there. V'ha'aravi'i, who is the fourth?
Germany.
Who?
Germany.
Holy Roman
The
Empire.
Holy Roman Empire.
I'm not sure. I was thinking Constantina is Constantine, who started the Christianity, and then you have Avignon. And then you have
Correct.
the Holy Roman Empire. So I wasn't sure. I thought it was Constantine.
So yeah, no, I think I think that'll be Bernie's Rashi on the Abarbanel, but I think when he says a Constantina Shnetak Moshava Kesarot,
I understand.
But I
hear it.
definitely hear that approach.
I hear
So
it.
then he says, during the days of Antonio, until today, like the Abarbanel dies in the early 1500s, right? The Holy Roman Empire. So he says that they had some sort of a ruling in Ashkenaz. I love this part. I have no other context for this. V'yesh Kabbalah biyata Yehudim Ashkenazim. I can only trust this is true, I guess, that the Ashkenazi Jews have some sort of Kabbalah. They have some sort of tradition. Shebihiyot Moshava Kesarot Shama Yavo HaMashiach. Once the Caesars, the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire who claimed the throne of ancient Rome were living in Germany, Holy Roman Empire, as we famously know, was not holy nor Roman. Shama Yavo HaMashiach. Then Mashiach will come. You can take it or you can leave it. Nevertheless, I thought it was a fascinating Abarbanel, which I felt compelled to share with you. But this is what the Abarbanel says. He thinks I can read it within the context of ancient Rome and the Roman Empire. So that's the Abarbanel's approach. He says the pshat is probably not the case, but that's my drush on the text. Okay. So that's the story with the Abarbanel, the 4 horns, and the 4 charashim. Okay, so then just the last couple of minutes we have together. So essentially what happens at the end of chapter 2? So essentially what happens is the following. After this story, we just pick up with verse 5, and it's good, but we're not reading it all inside anyway. In verse 5, what happens? I now see an ish, v'hinei ish uviyado chevel midah. Going back to that measuring, right? I said Hashem was measuring Yerushalayim. Now I see a man with a measuring tape. He's measuring Yerushalayim. He wants to know literally kama rachba v'kama arka. How long is it? How wide is it? Why is he doing this, and what's it going to represent? So we'll see in a moment. There's a little bit of a change in angels. One angel comes, one angel goes. What that means, not exactly clear. But he's moving on to a new angel who's going to now talk to him. Vayomer elav. He says to him, Roots da bear el hanar. He says, God says to the angel, go and speak to that Na'ar, that lad, which is why many assume that Zecharia was younger. He often is referred to as the Na'ar, right? Lay more. And maybe that's also why his Nevuot are a little bit more tricky to understand and a little bit more kind of out there, because maybe he was a little bit less trained in narrowing it down for us. So he says, listen, Prazot Teshev Yerushalayim. Jerusalem will be re-inhabited. Merov Adam uvehima b'docha. Animals, people are going to once again live in Yerushalayim. And what will I, God, be? Va'ani heyeh la ne'um Hashem chomat ish saviv. I will be a wall of fire for Yerushalayim, l'chavod eyeh b'tocha, for my glory to be inside. Perhaps what he's actually describing here is the fact that there won't be an actual wall around Yerushalayim. This is actually machlokas the Gemara discusses because of various nevuos. Will Yerushalayim in the future have a wall or not have a wall? Because what do you need a wall for? You need a wall to protect against enemies. If you don't have any enemies, you don't need a wall. So essentially, if there's going to be peace, what do I need the wall for? So Hashem says, listen, you don't need a wall. I will protect you because I, Hashem, going back to that notion of God as fire, going back to the midbar, I will be a chomat esh for you. I would say that in today's modern era, so the Ir HaAtika has a wall, but the Yerushalayim does not. So maybe the Gemara's Machlokes is like a teku, and we now know the answer. Maybe there's a little bit of both. But essentially, that's what he tells him. And the reason this is going to be is because I'm going to bring essentially the Jews back, Ke'arba Ruchos Hashamayim, just as they were blasted out of Yerushalayim through the 4 kingdoms, they will be brought back by me, Hashem. I will bring them back, and we will once again, it's very specific, Hoi Tzion Himalti Yoshevet Bat Bavel. Right, the Jews that essentially are living in Babylonia will return. So Pshat is that it's talking about the Jews who are living during the time period, but I would say that even in our own context, right, we almost describe ourselves as, continuing the exile of the Jews of Babylonia, right, to continue to be in exile. It started with Babylonia and it won't end until Mashiach. So that is essentially what he's describing right here. The next number of verses we won't read inside, but essentially it's positive descriptions of Roni v'simchi bat Zion. It's very classic language about redemption, right? Very classic redemptive language. You will return. I, Hashem, will protect you. So that's essentially what we see at the very end here. I'll just show you here. V'nilvu goyim rabim el Hashem. All the nations will come worship Hashem in Yerushalayim. They'll know Hashem, that my presence is here. Right, essentially the inheritance of Hashem and his people will be on this holy land, Admat Kodesh, which is this notion that Yehuda will also be much more holy than even Yerushalayim. Uvachar od b'Yerushalayim. I will choose Jerusalem. And then it's just at the very end here, Haskol basar mipnei Hashem kino or mimon kodsho. This is very reminiscent of many other nevuot, which is to say that once the Jews return, God will punish the enemies of our people. Be silent, everyone else, because you're wrong. Meaning, if you have not recognized Hashem, you're missing out, right? Something is deficient in your understanding of the world, of your understanding of Hashem. So that's essentially how chapter 2 comes to a close. Like I said in my original email, we were going to get to chapter 1 and 2 and maybe 3. So we're not going to get to 3 tonight. I don't want to rush it. So we'll conclude now. But essentially, Zecharia is a prophet that in many ways is on the one hand talking about the present, but on another level also talking about the future redemption of our people. People are coming back now. People will come back in the future. His prophecies are rich with really interesting imagery that have various levels of interpretation. And I think that's what makes it so interesting. And just like Rashi opened up the description saying, listen, it's close to us. On the one hand, that also allows us to delve even deeper and come up with our own interpretations as to what we think the Navi is really getting at. But at the end of the day, like Rashi says, Ad Moret Tzedek, until the Mashiach comes, we won't exactly know what he's saying. Next week, we will continue on with chapter 3. I'll send an email. I believe we'll probably do 3, 4, and 5 minimally. So that's what we'll end up doing next week. 3 is very, very short. So we'll do it really just quickly. And that's what we'll pick up with next week.
Thank you very much.
Have a good night, everyone. Happy to take questions and other comments.